I think Space Racer as a whole is more of a literary like plot device than he is a character. The more that I think about it, we don't know nothing about his personality. We don't really know much about his goals, his wants, his likes or dislikes, his ambitions. We know that he's strong. We know that he's strong because of his gun, at least. But again, he feels like more of a plot device than an actual character. With that said, like we said earlier, he did low-key put up player of the game performance during the 𝙏𝙖𝙡 War. He got like 1 or 2 𝙏𝙖𝙡mites out of there at the bare minimum, and not any of the fodder 𝙏𝙖𝙡mites too. He got that big tubby dude with the sideburns up out of there, Steve Harvey's boy. And so he got some good kills. All right, so I can see that. Cecil, on the other hand, Cecil is okay. Let's talk about Cecil. Because this was probably Cecil's weakest season on multiple fronts. All right, first of all, we have the Conquest debacle, right? If we're looking at it from an in-canon perspective, that nigga almost dropped a generational fumble with Conquest. Like, leaving Conquest alive, not burning his body into a crisp, even though I understand where his head was at when he made that decision, that was like all timeless levels of stupidity. Like genuine bozo shit, right? That could have endangered the entire galaxy. Had he gotten Conquest out of there, I don't know how much different the season would have gone. Obviously, Mark probably wouldn't have got his guts ripped out of him. Probably wouldn't have had to have that long recovery period. And so it probably would have expedited a lot of stuff that happened. However, I don't know how much would have changed, right? A lot of stuff just would have happened earlier rather than later. And, you know, maybe you could argue, okay, this is kind of a cascading domino effect argument, right? But you could argue Cecil leaving Conquest alive and Mark, and, you know, thus slowing down the coalition's progress on the war. You could argue that that slowed progress kind of opened them up to the eventual traitor arc and, you know, 𝙏𝙗 coming to the coalition planet and knocking shit off. Like, I feel like if they would have gotten things expedited, that might not have happened. It's hard to say. I'm trying to think of what else Cecil did. Okay, here's what I'm thinking, right? Cecil, and it's hard to remember, right? And I got to remember to like keep this in mind due to the nature of the season. There was a whole 2-3 or so episodes where like the Earth was the main part of the show, right? It's easy to kind of cast those first couple episodes out of your mind and remember the 𝙏𝙗𝙡 War. But there was the beginning with the Sequids and, you know, the Guardians of the Globe and whatever. Cecil put in his most work. I mean, as per usual, Cecil as a character does the most when he is in, when the camera is on Earth, when the narrative is taking place on Earth. When shit is happening in space, that's out of Cecil's hands, right? And so now that I'm looking at it, what makes this matchup interesting is the fact that we have a character that only kind of is relevant when shit is on Earth versus a character that's only relevant when shit is off Earth. Cecil did stand his ground against Nolan in the last episode. That was a cool moment. But I think broadly speaking, shit like the planet gun and, you know, all those sorts of things that Space Racer did, like the actual points that he put up on the board, I gotta go with Space Racer over Cecil. Which feels weird to say. Can we do a poll? All right, let's use the meter. All right, warm up the meter into red if you want to do Cecil. Cool down the meter into blue if you want to do Space Racer. Again, ice emoji cools the meter. Fire emoji warms the meter. I would say, I guess I'll go Space Racer. I don't know. Yeah, it's pretty close, but honestly, I'm going Space Racer. Hold on, let me make sure that working. I'm going Space Racer, and I think that's just what I'm going to go with in general. And that's what's interesting about the tournament sort of format, right? That's what's interesting about the tournament format is that Cecil could be argued to be above other characters on this list, But because he happened to face a character that was more prominent than him in the beginning, he's kind of out of there already before the shit even starts. And so, yeah. I'm going Space Racer. All right, this canon matchup for MVP. Thrag versus 𝙏𝙖𝙡. All right, this is low key. You're gonna have to hear me out on this one. Because this is gonna sound crazy. But okay, it's hard. And here's why. Thrag was probably MVP of the last 3 episodes. But Oliver had more of a performance throughout the whole season. Because Oliver kind of disappears after Thrag punches his jaw off. I think obviously we're going to have to give it to Thrag just because of his impact on the season, impact on like the community and shit. But it kind of hurts to see Oliver go so soon for the mere reason that I think Oliver shoots above a lot of these characters in this tournament. Just in a rather ironic manner, he gets put up against Thrag in the beginning. Did I create these matchups? No, the matchups are randomized. And that's kind of what makes this interesting is that, you know what I mean? A character like Oliver, who played a really big role in the season, did a lot for like the emotional development of the season during his parts with Nolan. And you know what I mean? A character like Oliver, who all things considered was pretty interesting and had, you know, a big moment. I just can't in good faith put him above Thrag. Which is crazy, right? Because I feel like this is probably the most play Oliver is going to get throughout the series. I can't see Oliver coming back and really doing anything crazy. But I mean, we don't even really have to break into like moments yet to put Thrag above Oliver, which is sad. I kind of hoped Oliver would get further into this tournament. I feel like he deserved like a semi-final run at the very least. But you know, what can you do when you're up against Thrag round 1? Ooh, okay, this one's interesting because this is another 2 big players are going to leave here. We have Thetus versus Alan. All right, already let's start off with Alan. Let's start off talking about Alan. Alan, you know what I mean? Alan adds a lot to the show just in terms of presence, right? He's funny as shit. He's just a fun character to be around when he's on screen. You know you're going to get some good squabbles, and if you're not going to get some good squabbles, you might, you know, get some good moments, some good laughs, some good gaffes. And even if not that, you might get some decent emotional moments. And so all things together, all things put together, Alan is a great character. However, season 4 exclusive, I think Thetus, he did a lot. First of all, you could argue that Thetus was the driving force behind the season. You could argue that Thetus was the driving force behind this season's progression, right? He was the one like inciting the Viltrumite War. He was the one, you know, making the decisions, calling the shots. We didn't see much character development from him. I do feel like he was pretty stagnant throughout the season. And then he did have his moment of getting his dome ripped clean off by Thrag. But I can't sit here and act like Thetus's moments weren't interesting, right? He was an interesting leader. His morality was interesting. I think they could have dug into that a bit more. I really wanted to see how far he would go. Or maybe not go. We'll see. This is another matchup where we have 2 heavy hitters in the beginning that should definitely make it further into this list, right? Because now, like, there's a chance that Steve Harvey or someone makes it further into the shit than Thetus, which doesn't feel right, or Alan. Thetus is the MVP of the galaxy for almost completely wiping out the Viltrumites. That is true. Here's the debacle that I'm having with these two, right? In my opinion, I feel like Thetus has more in-canon relevance, has more plot relevance than Alan does, at least so far. However, as a character, right, from a meta perspective, I find myself more attached to Alan in his development than Thetus. And so it's weird, right? It's like you kind of got to make the decision between these two of which is more important. Thetus, you know, pushing the story forward and kind of causing the whole environment that the show is taking place in, or Alan kind of being a fan favorite and doing his thing like that. This might be an unpopular opinion, but I think I'm going Thetus. For one, I see Alan heavily being set up to be a major player as the show goes on, with him now at the head of the coalition and whatnot. But two, Alan was really like, this season, he did 3 memorable things, right? Or like the things he did can be separated into 3 categories. All right. He had some cool fight / support moments. He was really good support, whether it was, you know, gathering all the supplies with Nolan, whether it was backing up TJ during the squabbles, whether it was, you know, all the shit he did with the war was a lot of support shit, which, you know, nothing wrong with that. So, you know, he had his support moments. He had his comic relief moments. And then he was like smashing Talia every 37 seconds. Those 3 things right there were dead ass like the only things he really did as far as like actual plot is concerned. Where Thetus, on the other hand, you know what I mean? He is arguably, apart from like Mark, maybe Thrag, he's arguably the biggest progressor of plot in this season. And so again, we have another situation where it's like, damn, I really wanted both of these characters to advance further, but because they were put up against each other, I gotta go Thetus. And I think it's telling, right? We have the successor versus the predecessor. I mean, this was the predecessor season. This was the season where the predecessor was in charge. And so I think he played a bigger role. Conquest versus Eve. It's weird, right? Both of these characters kind of fall into, okay, when you actually think about it, right? Both of these characters fall into the same sort of role this season. And it's kind of a disappointing role in the sense that both of these characters were very compelling on their own. But this season, they got relegated into like pieces for Mark's development. You know what I'm saying? Conquest had his interesting moments at the end of season 2. Coming into season 3, I was expecting a lot. And then he kind of just came in here and fought Mark once or twice. Damn, sirens coming just from mentioning the name of Conquest. Yeah, Conquest kind of came in here, fought Mark once or twice, and then was gone. Eve has a very similar role, you know, very interesting, compelling character. And then she kind of came in there, disappeared for the lion's share of the show, and then came back at the end largely to further Mark's development, right? The most compelling aspect of her character, which was the most compelling aspect of her arc this season, which was the whole, you know, pregnancy abortion arc. All of that was off screen. And so we saw the beginning, we saw her getting pregnant and her powers getting fucked up. Okay, that's interesting. I wonder where they're going to go with that. We went off cam for she was off cam for, you know, again, the lion's share of the season. And then by the time we came back, she had already worked through the majority of that issue on her own. And, you know, again, was really only there to bounce off of Mark. Pause. Literally and from a narrative perspective. We did get spaghetti from Conquest. That's true. That's true. I think I'm going to give it to Conquest on the low. Just because of that moment. just because of the squabble, you know, the guts moment. Anything, in my opinion, everything compelling about Eve was handled off screen. The whole pregnancy / abortion, that was interesting. We didn't see none of it besides the beginning and the end. The relationship with her family, we didn't get much of that either. Again, she kind of was just there as like an extension of Mark a lot of the times. I mean, this squabble led to character development with Nolan and Oliver. Yeah, that's true. It did kick that off as well. It did kick that off as well. Yeah, I think I gotta go Conquest. And I wasn't even the biggest Conquest fan this season. I thought his character kind of fell flat from what I was expecting. She really saved Mark. I mean, she had one scene where she was like, we'll be fine. But again, like, what did she do as an individual character that was compelling, that wasn't related to Mark in some way? And like, obviously, right, as a side character in a story about Mark, you know what I mean? By some metric, everything we see is going to be related to Mark. But I don't feel like this is the best we've seen from Eve. I hope we see more from Eve, like, as shit moves on. I just have to give it to Conquest, because at the end of the day, I think one of the scenes that is most going to be remembered from this season will be the fight with Conquest and him ripping Mark's guts out. We're like, and again, the abortion shit, that could have been a really big, memorable moment, but I just don't think they played it right. I don't think we got enough into Eve's feelings with that. And so I'm going Conquest. Think Eve is peak though? That is true. That is true. Okay, this low-key isn't even a comparison, bro. I'm not gonna lie, Battle Beast super underwhelmed me this season, bro. Super underwhelmed me, bro. I thought he was gonna go out there and really be like putting in action. He did nothing. Like, he did nothing but growl at the camera before the war. Whereas, you know, Debbie, she did turn into a tsundere at the end, and that's definitely going to come back to bite her as we advance further and further through this tournament. However, when we're looking at going up against Battle Beast, who literally put up 0 points on the board, in my opinion, it's because he can't fight in space. That's fair. That explains it. That doesn't excuse it. You know, all he really did was get bodied by Viltrumites. I ain't see no interesting character moments. I ain't see any, you know what I mean? It's like, okay. And let's say Battle Beast isn't even one of those characters that's going to have really deep, interesting, introspective character moments. That's fair. At the very least, give me something cool. His whole thing is being cool. That's Battle Beast, bro. He gets in the squabble and looks cool. But like Debbie, this season, again, she has MVP moments. She definitely has player of the game moments, player of the ep moments. Easily. But like Deb, you know what I mean? And again, as we move forward, we're going to have to open some serious dialogues on Deb and how that last episode deconstructed everything she had built up to potentially be the MVP of this season. But like right now, it's truly no comparison, bro. Not at all. I'm giving it to Big Deb. First red character we have winning, by the way. Paul versus Robot. Okay. All right. Side character versus side character. Okay. So Robot, he had his thing with the Sequids, right? I would argue that Robot was the MVP of the Sequid arc. And Paul, he's like, ironically enough, right? I feel like it fits the bill for the way his character is used in the story. Paul is dead ass like the side character of all side characters, bro. He's like the super side character. You know what I mean? With that said, though, what he does for the story isn't bad. And I think this is another one of those versions of, do we look at the narrative or do we look at the canon? If we look at the canon, Robot had his moments, you know, going to that planet. The Sequid fights, etc., etc. We're like, Paul, narratively, I think, provides very important contrast to the rest of what's going on in this series. You feel me? Paul is there in the mix. I mean, obviously, we have the whole Debbie relationship. We have the big Paul moments. Excuse me. If you're in the YouTube stream, slide on over to Twitch, by the way. Paul existed to add tension when Nolan arrived for his first apology. I think that was one of his roles, but I think broadly speaking, he did provide some like contrast, right? Where we have all of these superpowered beings. He almost became what Debbie was in season 1 and like the beginning of season 2, right? Part of what made Debbie's arc interesting was that she was the normal human amongst all of these like super beings. Right? That was like the setup for her character. That's one of the things that made her interesting. Once Debbie kind of became more embroiled in, you know, into the world of all the crazy shit that happens in Invincible, whether that was Mark getting his powers, you know, Oliver, you know, I mean, Paul said it himself, whether she thought of it that way or not, you know, all the crazy stuff was her world, right? And I feel like Paul kind of filled the role that Debbie used to have, where it was like, okay, Paul was the contrast, right? Paul was like the normal guy amongst all of the crazy shit going on. No, I say Debbie definitely fumbled Paul. I'd say Debbie if I'm keeping it a stack, I'd say Debbie fumbled Paul. And the only reason I say that, the reason I'm not even giving Paul like trouble for fumbling Debbie, I know I was joking about it. But no, if we look at it objectively, I think it's pretty clear that Debbie entered the relationship thinking she was in one place of her life, thinking she was one way, you know, think she was ready for a more normal life, when, you know what I mean, she clearly wasn't, and that's why their relationship fell apart. You know what I mean? If we're saying their relationship, if we're saying the core agreement behind their relationship was, you know, we want something normal and human, we want something normal and earthly, rather, right? I'm sure, you know, obviously that's the whole pretext to Paul's character. And then that's, you know, where Debbie thought she was at the beginning of the season. If we're saying that, you know, the whole, like, because all relationships are agreements, right? About, okay, we want this and we don't want this. If we're saying the basis of their relationship was, we want something normal and separated from all this super stuff. And then, you know, the super stuff comes up, and Debbie can no longer handle the relationship how she thought she wanted to. That's fine. That's 100% her prerogative. But that does technically make it a fumble on her part, because, you know, it was because of her and what she potentially truly wanted. I don't know how her shit is going to continue to develop with Omni-Man, but it was because of her that, you know what I mean? It was because of her that relationship, I mean, we can only really infer, right? Because it was off screen, but it was probably because of her that relationship didn't work out. Anywho, back to the task at hand, right? I forgot this wasn't dialogue on their relationship. This was Paul versus Robot. Again, still kind of difficult for me, right? Robot did his thing-ish in the beginning. And you know what? I'm gonna go Paul. I'm gonna go Paul as like a requiem. You know, this is clearly what Paul's presence on the show was clearly winding down by the end of the season. You know, we probably won't be getting much more Paul moving forward. The show just doesn't seem to be going in that direction. Yeah, we probably won't be getting much more spaghetti. But with that said, I do like what he added to the story. You know, just broadly speaking. And yeah, I think I gotta go Paul. Maybe not because he was, you know, made the craziest impact on the season narratively, but like I feel like we got to give him some respect, bro. We at least got to let him advance one round or so, because he did his thing. He did his thing. Last word from Paul, give him hell. That boy thought this was a baseball game. I'm going with Paul. Okay. Ooh, okay, we getting serious here. Ooh. Ooh, they really want some dialogues opened early. This is like damn near a finals matchup if we're keeping it a stack. These were the two most important characters in the season. Undoubtedly. So let's look at both of them, you know, let's look at both of them and what they did, right? Let's start with Mark. I want to start with Mark. No, I want to start with Nolan, actually, because the more I think about this, the more this, like, you know, flips around in my brain, the more obvious it becomes. Nolan, maybe apart from Thetus and potentially Thrag, Nolan was like the mover and shaker of the season. I would honestly say over Thrag and Thetus, potentially. I don't know. But I feel like the core of this season was like Nolan's development his emotional development, his personal development as a man, his personal development as a father. Whereas Mark kind of served two purposes, right? Obviously, as the MC, he keeps the story moving forward. We're looking at it through his eyes. But also he was kind of like torture porn, bro. A lot of his time on screen, and I mean, you know, you could say this about the whole show to an extent, but sometimes the show does kind of dip into being the Mark pain and depression compilation, which, you know, does make his character stronger when you think about, you know, his resilience being a core aspect of his character. You know, every time he gets beat down, he gets back up and, you know, has the heart of a warrior, has, you know, never gives up. That's his whole thing. You know, it's not his body that's invincible, it's his spirit. But like, okay, and here's, now that I'm thinking about it, we got to look in canon too. That boy Mark is still kind of underperforming in my book. I mean, well, we had the Conquest fight, right? That was an overperformance, honestly. I'd go as far as to say that was a fluke. I don't know if that's a crazy take, but I would say the Conquest dub was kind of a fluke, bro. Kind of a fluke, a little bit of a fluke. I think if him and Conquest fought 10 times, Conquest is winning 7 or 8 times. I still don't even really know how he pulled that off. I'm not going to hold you. He pulled that off because of plot and narrative necessity. Because the fact that he was able to keep his hands wrapped around Conquest's throat as his guts were being ripped out. How did he even choke Conquest? I'm assuming it was a blood choke because his face started turning purple. I think he cut off circulation to his head. Because, yeah, it definitely couldn't have been an air choke. But like Nolan, on the other hand, Nolan was probably the strongest on the hero side, on the coalition side. Let me think. I mean, apart from that dude's gun, Nolan was the strongest. But that aside, yeah, the Lightning Lady, first episode of the season, true. But all that aside, like whether it was Debbie, whether it was Ollie, whether it was Mark, whether it was Thrag, everyone's kind of bouncing off Nolan in this season. Pause. And so I think I'm gonna go Nolan with these two, between these two, at least for this season. Ooh, TJ versus Steve Harvey. Now I think Steve Harvey is the only side character Viltrumite that I managed to get into this roster because, you know, he will put in the most work. I expected more from TJ, but let's not forget her last couple episodes, bro. I think we expected more from TJ because we didn't know what her role was. When she really slotted into her role as like a backline support character, she kinda was doing her thing. She was kinda doing her thing when she got her little darts, right? First of all, she had the island escape in the beginning. Okay, that was cool. I think she was, you know, a relatively compelling character, just enjoyable to watch, interacting with the rest of the group. She kind of funny, kind of cool. And, you know, Steve Harvey was interesting, right? Because if we're talking pure numbers, Steve Harvey was doing some work. Steve Harvey was doing some work out there. The reason I put him on here is because I think he had the best performance out of all the Viltrumite side characters in this, you know, who were fighting under Thrag. I think he did better than Craig. I think he did better than Anissa. I think he did better than Thula. I think he did better than all those niggas, really. Conquest. Steve Harvey low-key, like 6 man, you know? And so that's why he's on here. Honestly, these two characters, this is another tough one because these two characters fill very similar roles, right? Where they're like kind of support, they're kind of off screen a lot of the time. I think because TJ is a hero, we saw more of her interacting as like a person, right? On the ship when they were kind of having their little, I don't want to say slice of life moments. Were there any big moments? Were there any big Steve Harvey moments that I'm forgetting? We know he went down to Earth with the rest of the gang. Okay, sure. We know that. We know he was giving Alan some decent squabbles back and forth. When he made, is that how you spell feud, my boy? Good luck on your essay, bruh. When the world got destroyed. The look he had when the planet was destroyed? What, the meme look with Alan? We had Alan in the sleeper hole. Steve Harvey unironically solos? I mean, yeah, Steve Harvey would probably whoop her ass, but I want to give it to TJ on the low. I'm not going to hold you. I don't think any of them had really standout performances. She ran, yeah, but like she also stacked some assist points. She's a new character. We know her fun personality. He's just a warrior we don't know much about. That's what I'm saying, right? I feel like Steve Harvey might have put in a bit more points, right? If we're looking at points on the board and the actual war itself, yeah, it's definitely Steve. But if we zoom out and look at narrative, bro, and you tell me like, okay, Steve Harvey and Tech Jacket are both going to get off screen before next season starts, who are you going to be more disappointed about? Okay, actually, I kind of set myself up there because the answer would be Steve Harvey, only because I'm very interested in seeing how the Viltrumites interact with Earth. But like broadly speaking, right? Let's say at some point during the Viltrumite War, they crashed into each other and they both died, right? You know, Steve punched her guts out, boom, and Tech managed to get one of those darts into Steve, and Alan finished him off. All right, and they both died at the same time. Who would I be more disappointed of not being in the show anymore? It's got to be Tech Jacket. I don't see anything compelling about Steve yet. We know nothing about him. He's just a big body. He's just a big body that fights well. Tech Jacket had an actual character. I'm sure Steve will. I mean, you know, he's looking like, if we're going off the last episode, right? The 3 Viltrumites they decided to show living on Earth were Anissa, Craig, and Steve. So I'm sure they're going to do something compelling with all 3 of those characters, or at the very least, some of them. But I just, yeah, honestly, I haven't seen enough from him yet to advance him into the role. To advance him up this MVP list, I haven't seen enough yet from either of these characters. But I've seen more from Tech Jacket. You know what I mean? I'm more interested in her development as a hero, especially since she's so young. I'm more interested in her development as a hero than I am in Steve's development as whatever he might be at the current moment. Again, I think he might become interesting when we see how he interacts with Earth. But for this season, I'm putting TJ over Steve. Are we in round 2 already? We are. Whew, okay. Okay. All right, we're gonna have to talk about this because I'm unironically feeling Paul. I'm unironically feeling Paul right now. And here's why. Again, first of all, we have to accept that these 2 characters serve vastly different roles in the show, right? You know what I mean? We can't compare these 2 characters based off of like any in-canon metrics, right? Because Conquest, all right, it's like, how cool is he? How much of a threat does he feel like? How much, how cool are the fights? Whatever. Where Paul, it's like, okay, how much does he develop the human side of these characters? I think this is what I was trying to vocalize during the last round with Paul that I didn't really get out too well. I think the thing I like about Paul in the contrast he provides is that it develops the human side of characters like Oliver and Mark. And I mean, Oliver doesn't have a human side, but personhood, human in quotes, who's the real human type shit, right? Conquest is kind of like Dev is saying, right? I feel like Conquest spiritually died at the end of, was it season 3? Yeah, I wanted to say season 2, but no, it's season 3. Conquest, okay, so boom, right? The thing that made Conquest so cool during the end of season 3 was shock value. All of a sudden, we have this huge super Viltrumite tank nigga with a metal arm coming down and just ripping the planet to shreds because he can. Just abusing our whole cast, right? The animation starts going crazy. He starts whispering in Mark's ear, and even, some of the compelling parts about him, his loneliness and, the things that could have potentially been explored to make him a more compelling character. Those were kind of just, dropped to the side, casually bought up as like almost like a comic relief moment, if we're being real. Mark threw it in his face and that was in confidence. We have 2 spaghetti makers here, right? So let's analyze the different spaghettis because I actually think this is a good comparison to use. All right, we look at Conquest spaghetti, right? It was a brutal, gory, Invincible trademark moment, the big, brutal, gory, over-the-top fights, and it was cool. It's going to be one of the most remembered moments of the whole series. I'm pretty sure when the creators were talking about, oh yeah, the goriest moment yet is in this season, I'm almost certain they were talking about that, bro. We saw that boy's small intestine being pulled out of his body like dental floss, being pulled out of the little cases. And so that was cool. But again, narratively, it kind of just served as like, ooh, like, whoa. Again, Mark torture porn. Paul developing the human side of these characters was one of the most interesting aspects to me. And the way he bounced off Debbie, again, not literally, even though I guess he did literally too, was bouncing off of her. The way we saw Mark and Ollie coming around, you know what I mean? He was like a good metric of normalcy, kind of kept things grounded. For a while, I think he could have had an interesting dynamic with Nolan, even though, it appears we're not going in that direction anymore. And here's kind of the gist of why I'm probably going to pick Paul. At the end of the day, I feel like Conquest and what he did this season was a step down from what he did last season, right? He was reeled in a little bit and used a bit more as a narrative device. Whereas Paul, for better or worse, was kind of pushed forward, made more relevant and more interesting. Again, that last episode, you could tell the last episode felt like a shift in many different ways, right? It damn near felt like they were like, all right, you know, we're driving down a highway, right? The last episode of season 4 felt like we were taking an exit, like we were about to go into a whole new highway, because the speed and the severity at which they changed so many things so quickly, you know, did damage. You know, the collateral of that did a lot of damage to a lot of characters. Paul, Debbie, Eve, arguably. You know, I mean, a lot of what they had been building up the past 3 seasons, 4 seasons minus 1 episode. You can almost feel them, like you could feel the change, which I think that was intentional, right? Shit was supposed to feel different. This is a post-Viltrumite war. We got a bunch of Viltrumites living on the planet. Like, yeah, it's different. Things are changing now, and it's supposed to feel that way. But I think Paul got caught in the collateral of that. But yeah, honestly, broadly speaking, I think I'm taking Paul over Conquest, bro. Conquest really didn't do nothing but a couple cool fight moments. And maybe if he was going against another fighter character, I could argue that he beats them because he had cooler fight moments. But if we're talking about how each of these characters played their role respectively, I'm going Paul. So Paul advances 2 rounds. Paul advances 2 rounds. Damn, we got our 2 ladies, bruh. At the end of this dialogue, only one lady will survive, and I don't think it's really an argument about who, right? I mean, shout out Deb and shout out TJ. I think this character does kind of suffer from sausage party syndrome sometimes. And so I like that these characters are kind of holding it down for the ladies. I feel like moving forward, I don't know how much TJ is going to be in this story. I know Tech Jacket, Tech Jacket has their own run of comics, like outside of the anime or cartoon. That boy tweaking. Tech Jacket has their own run, right? It's a he in the comics. So I wonder if they're going to maybe do something more with her. But like, we can save a lot of time here. Tech Jacket just didn't do enough to even be close to where Debbie is in the broader progression of this season. So yeah, I'm going Deb. I'm going Deb pretty easily. This fight happens to mirror how their fight went in canon. In other words, I'm pretty sure Nolan abuses Space Racer, bro. He's taking that gun, putting it off to the side, and burying him under, what was it, 1,000 tons of rock? I forgot. Low-key, how did he survive that? What's going on? I guess the suit probably kept him alive. But yeah, this is honestly as far as Space Racer can advance. You know what I mean? Space Racer made it to this point off of like putting points on the board in canon during the fight, helping to destroy the planet. You know, again, points on the board, player of the game shit, hitting some good snipes, taking out some Viltrumites when we needed them taken out the most. But like, at this point now, we're talking about characters who really, like, you know, move the emotional core of this show, you know, who narratively were important. And Space Racer just wasn't that, unfortunately. And so, you know, I can't even in good faith even entertain this, bro. Let's be so for real right now. It's Nolan. Thetus versus Thrag. Okay, well, we know how this went in canon. I choose death. Rip that boy head clean off. But let's look at it narratively, because this is interesting. This is interesting. First of all, these two characters, they were like, I would say they were the core. Like, if I had to pick like the two biggest ops in this season, the two characters that butt heads the most, you know, the two characters whose respective disagreement was fleshed out most in this season, it's these two. You know what I mean? Thetus and Thrag. This season kind of documented the beginning, middle, and end of their relationship as both allies and enemies, which was interesting. Thetus, of course, was paramount in being the leader of the coalition and moving the war forward. And then Thrag, on the other side, was paramount in being the leader of the Viltrumites and moving the war forward on his end. Yeah, massive parallels between these two characters. I think they could be seen as similarly valuable on their respective sides. What's good, Yuns? Welcome to the stream. I think they could be seen as similarly valuable on their respective sides. They were both leaders. They both put up numbers in terms of squabbles. Like, yeah, they were both out there for real. However, again, if we're looking at MVP, right? If we're looking at who made the most noise, and now I'm taking it beyond narrative, I'm taking it beyond meta. I'm taking it beyond in canon, I'm taking it beyond narrative and going to meta. Thrag probably had the biggest community impact on the season, and that's going to push him far in this. That's going to push him far in this roster, right? In this tournament. You know what I mean? You don't know how many fucking Thrag memes I've seen. Dudes role playing as Thrag on TikTok. Thrag gifs all over the place. How many? Oh my god! Do you know how many fucking? Do I have a bug in my monitor again? Yes, I do. Oh, what? Where'd it go? Oh, it's down there. Oh, okay. So I can kind of knock him down by. Okay, yeah, I have a bug in my monitor. I didn't know he was still in there. That's kind of disappointing. I thought he had left. Yes, in my monitor. There's a bug in my monitor. Let's see. What was I saying? Yeah, like Thrag's on Tomodachi. Oh, that's what I was about to say. You don't know how many like power scaling nerds I've seen. Like how much power scaling bullshit I've seen for Thrag recently. Shit is crazy. Shit is crazy. And so yeah, I'm definitely going to go Thrag here. Because if we say they're about equal in canon, if we say they're about equal narratively, and then we take it in the meta, how it works in the real world, how they're received in the real world, Thrag just kind of blows Thetus out of the water. And you know, that's kind of the three levels we got to look at, right? Obviously, narrative and canon are kind of hand in hand. But when we start looking in the MVP, we got to look at like how it's received by us, the viewers. And so I'm going Thrag. I'm going Thrag. Okay, we're in the semifinals, it appears, because now we're going to have to open some serious dialogues. We basically have the character that carried the prior half of the show going by the character that carried the latter half of the show. Of the season. I mean, Thrag really didn't show up for what, 1 or 2 episodes? This is going to be tough. This is going to be tough. I'm not going to hold you. This is probably, I'm not going to lie, this is probably the toughest matchup we'll get. This is probably the toughest matchup we'll get. On one hand, we have Debbie. I think Debbie, to a large extent, had... Okay, here's what I'm seeing here, right? Debbie, in my opinion, had, like, MVP moments in terms of the emotional core of this season. The beginning, right? Her interactions with Nolan, her interactions with her children, interactions with Paul. And yeah, even at the end, seeing her want to go check on Oliver, of course, you know, that is tainted by her, who she's going with and sort of the soon-to-day type activity they've been giving her. But I do think her scene, this scene right here that's pictured on this image that you're looking at right now, I do think that scene right there is some all-time lit shit in terms of this show. That's arguably the best scene in the show. You know, maybe apart from like Omni-Man tweaking out in season 1 and shit like that. You know, this is one of those scenes that you felt. On the other hand, we have Thrag, right? Played the exact opposite role in this season, right? He was the main threat. He was almost fully like combat, fear, aggression, hype, aura based. You know, we have all the memes of him. These two, it's like this, right? If we look at these two characters and the respective roles that they play, they both played their roles, for the most part, at the top of their game. There may be a dialogue to be opened about Debbie at the end of the season. However, I won't let niggas forget. Y'all were treating Thrag kind of crazy during his introduction too. Oh, he not living up to what I expected. Blah, 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 blah. Right? So if we want to talk about Debbie's weak points at the end of the season, I feel like we got to talk about Thrag's debatably weak points at the beginning. And when I look at this matchup, here's what I'm seeing, right? Both low-key assumed today, but that's a good ass point. That boy Nolan got hoes, bruh. Here's what I'm seeing, right? Thrag is clearly set up. He's clearly on an upward trajectory, right? Debbie, from what I can see, and who knows, I could be wrong, but from what I can see, is probably on a downward trajectory. Where we are right now, I think those two trajectories are intersecting. So they're about equal, right? They're at the midpoint. They're at the, what do you call that shit? What was the mathematical term for that midpoint between two lines? I haven't done geometry in a brick. But they're at the midpoint. I know one of y'all know. Equilibrium, break even. No, it wasn't that. It was a specific term. Hold on. Mathematical term for midpoint between two. It wasn't bisector. It was it just intersection point? Intersection. I guess it was just intersection point. I thought it had some like fancy word, but maybe not. Anyhow. Right now, these two characters' trajectories are intersecting. However, because Thrag ended on a real high note in the same episode that Deb kind of ended on a low note. Thrag with the "you have no choice. You have no choice to make, yet you must make one." And then Debbie over here talking about, "Fine, I'll go to space with you. Baka." But out of respect for Deb, Thrag will definitely be in this discussion next season. I think. I don't know, unless we get sidetracked and don't really look at him. But Thrag will be in this discussion like when we're looking back on the show. Deb, it might be about over for her. So I feel like we got to give her her flowers while she's still here. I still think her scene with Nolan was one of the most cathartic scenes in the series, regardless of how much they're trying to walk that back potentially now. Thrag had his moments. Thrag could easily, in my mind, and I mean, he made it to the semifinals. He easily could be a finals contender. But I think I gotta give it to Deb. I truly and honestly think I gotta give it to Deb. And I don't think it's insane to say that. Okay, so okay, I think it's fair to say that this wasn't supposed to happen. I can name about 5 characters. This is still semifinals. I can name about 5 characters that probably swung above Paul in this tournament, right? Mark, Ollie, Thetus. I mean, that's just to say the least, really. That's just to say the least. And that's what makes the tournament format so interesting, right? Is that Paul kind of cheesed his way up here by going against relatively less impactful characters early on. And now he cheesed his way into the semifinals. We got Debbie's exes, the battle of Debbie's exes. Yeah, he had an easy like Cinderella run up to the top. But I think it's over. I think the Paul Cinderella run is over, and it's time to, come back down to reality and be for real with ourselves. Paul, he did what he could, and a lot of the interesting aspects about him were the contrast he provided to Nolan, particularly in Debbie's life. Whether that was the contrast he provided as like a father, sort of male role model figure, whether that was the contrast he provided as, not being a super strength flying brick that can fly through planets. But at the end, it's just crazy that Paul made it up here to me. That shit is hilarious to me. But at the end of the day, we got to be for real. We got to be serious. Nolan is taking this. Nigga told him, give him hell. Nolan is taking this. I mean, you know what I mean? Nolan just had more emotional impact on the season, where Paul just wasn't really there. It is kind of hilarious that it's Paul versus Nolan, bro. Honestly, the odds of Paul making it this far are kind of crazy, because that means, who did he beat out? He beat Conquest. And I forgot who he beat at the beginning, but he had to go against 2 bums. When low key, I probably would have picked TJ over Paul. I would have picked TJ over Paul. How did he beat Conquest? Conquest didn't do anything but aura moments this season, bro, and get choked out. He didn't do it. I'm not going into the whole dialogue again. You're gonna have to watch the video. Where I feel like the role Paul provided was more interesting than Conquest. But anywho, back to the task at hand. I would have picked TJ over Paul. I would have picked almost anyone in the... no, I can't say that. I wouldn't have picked Space Racer over Paul, I don't think. But I would have picked TJ over him. I would have picked Ollie over him for sure. I would have picked Mark over him. A lot of characters I would have picked over Paul. But Paul just so happened to cheese his way to here. And so, it's funny, but no. All right, let's move on to the finals. Welcome to the stream. Welcome. Eve over Paul? Nah, I'm not taking Eve over Paul. Is this the finals? This is the finals. Ooh, this is kind of funny. This is kind of funny because this is I think, and I didn't even do this on purpose. Isn't the image of Omni-Man him standing in her house? It's like his reaction to what she's saying. That's kind of funny. Anywho. Okay. First of all, these two characters in their arcs are inextricably tied at this point. Irremovable from each other. And I mean, we can tell because they're clearly trying to smush these characters back together too. For better or worse. What this becomes for me is like a battle of one high, like a bunch of like, okay. Debbie had the best moment in the season in my book. Nolan didn't have as many highs, or didn't have as high a high as Debbie. But if we look at, the average of the season, I feel like he put up more points across the board. Are you sure? I mean, I'm willing to hear any arguments about, any highs that Paul had. I mean, not Paul. That boy Paul is still in my brain. That Debbie had over Omni-Man. I mean, Omni-Man over Debbie, rather. But yeah, what this comes down to for me is that I think Omni-Man, Nolan just did more, right? Like emotion wise, he had his moments with Art, his moments with Debbie. He might not have been the biggest emotional player in the season, but he had his moments. He was also in the fight. He was there during the fight, putting up points on the board. Obviously, we can't really hold Debbie to that standard, but I'm just saying, like, again, Omni-Man performed in an area where Debbie wasn't even present. His apology was weak as hell, but I wouldn't say that was a bad moment per se, narratively. You know what I mean? On top of that, I can't forget his development with Oliver. I like that a lot. His development with his sons was great this season. I think all in all, Nolan just did more. Yeah, Debbie wouldn't have her moment if it were for Nolan's. That's true. But also at the same time, Nolan wouldn't have his moment if it wasn't for like again, these two arcs are inextricably tied. But I think it kind of comes down to like Debbie is getting smoked. Okay, this whole thing mirrors the season, right? Like, let's think about this. Debbie was moving great throughout the whole tournament. Then at the very end, because of her interaction with Nolan, I told you it was going to come back to bite her. We really got to open the dialogue about her movement in that last episode. I'm not saying it was it felt a little out of character. It was unsatisfying in my book. It was out of character in my book. And it kind of delegitimized her best moments in the series. Because it showed that for all her talk, she was willing to, she was willing to spin back. For all her talk of getting over it. And again, I don't think it's a horrible character moment. Maybe an unsatisfying character moment. I don't think it was horribly written. Could have been worse. But like, you know what I mean? It did, in my book, take a lot away from... It almost like hollowed out what we've seen before. You know what I mean? You ever had a falling out with a friend or a loved one, someone close to you, and they do something, they do something you can't fuck with, and you're like, damn, like, these memories that I have of you weren't bad memories at the time and aren't bad memories, but they feel hollowed out by how things ended. It was kind of like that, right? I look back on Debbie's development fondly, and I still think it was and is, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're not going to have her run back, but I don't know. But anyhow, yeah, like I can still look back on her development fondly and say, wow, that was a great arc. But at the end of the day, it feels hollowed out by how things are. You know what I mean? You can't just look at how things were without taking into account how things are. And so all in all, for that reason, for just, the all around presence in the series, Nolan maybe has the most screen time in the whole season. Well, apart from Mark, maybe. This could be a video on its own, but I think I gotta give it to Nolan. Nolan had a great season, put up an amazing performance. Just in terms of, being a character. And at the end of the day, he pulled her back. It looks like he's in the process of pulling her back, which is a crazy green, bro. That boy took the shot from the half court line, and right now it looks like it's about to hit off the backboard and go in. So congratulations to Nolan. I gotta give it to him. I think that makes him the winner. Yep. The MVP of Invincible Season 4 was Nolan, Omni-Man, and I can't even say I'm mad at that. I can't even say that that's out of the way. I can't even say that's crazy.